Welcome to Get Over It, the consciousness transforming podcast for exceptional 21st century living. Folks, we have a treat today. We're going to have Rizwan Virk with us, and he's talking about the book Wisdom of a Yogi. And this is based on the autobiography of a yogi. And as I was telling him before we started the show, I had bought that book and I attempted to read it literally 40 times, and I just wasn't getting it. However, once I read his book, I was able to go back and piece the two books together, and I have a fuller understanding. So we want to thank him for that. But again, the book title is Wisdom of a Yogi, Lessons for a Modern Seekers from Autobiography of a Yogi. And you're really going to enjoy this show today. Now, the information shared on Get Over It uses intuitive and pragmatic insight to help you shift your consciousness to break through the blocks and release energy that is no longer needed. Yes, we're going to help you let go of the BS that is holding you back. But you guys know I always ask, are you truly ready to? And by the way, folks, BS is belief system. A bit about me for my new listeners: intuitive since birth. I'm a third generation intuitive with over 3 decades of experience supporting people to break through the blocks along their path. I'm a strategist for personal and professional transformation, revealing cutting-edge information that enables you to prosper and thrive. I spent 25 successful years in corporate America as an executive sales professional, and I am the founder of Healing Visions Ministries and the Northern California Children's Education Network, a 501c3 nonprofit. I provide consultations and healings in all areas of life that heal the mind-body-spirit connection, allowing you to live your very best life. My clients tell me that I keep it real while providing them with accurate information to assist them along their journey as a spirit living a human existence. But they also say, if you really don't want to know, don't ask Monique. My background includes a doctorate in metaphysics, Reiki master teacher, ordained minister, and clinical hypnotherapist. So whether you are stressed, depressed, or possessed, I can help. To find out more about me and the services I offer, go to my website, and that's MoniqueChapman.com. I invite you to like and follow me on Facebook and LinkedIn. Don't look for me on former Twitter because I'm not there. Now, my guest today, Rizwan Virk, is a successful entrepreneur, venture capitalist, and founder of Play Labs at MIT. A graduate of MIT and Stanford, he is currently at Arizona State University. He is the author of Zen Entrepreneurship, Startup Myths and Models, Treasure Hunt, and the Stimulation Hypothesis, and the Stimulated Multiverse, which is an excellent book, folks. You should check that one out. And you can check him out at his website, and that's zenentrepreneur.com. Again, his website is zenentrepreneur.com. Welcome, Riz.
Hi, Monique. Thanks for having me on your show.
It's great for you to be here today. I really, as we shared earlier, I was having a difficult time getting into the autobiography, and I really wanted to, 40 times, but you simplified it. And to my opinion, you made it accessible for today's world. What made you decide to take this work and bring it into present time?
Well, I've been a big fan of Yogananda's autobiography of a yogi, since I first read it back in the 90s. And of course, the book was that book was pretty well known to within a certain generation, like in the 60s and 70s. It was, probably one of the most passed around books of that generation. And people like George Harrison used to give away copies of it to everyone he met, from the Beatles. And for Steve Jobs, it was his favorite book. And so, when I first started getting into the spiritual world as a Gen Xer myself, it was sort of passed down to me by my kind of boomer mentors, if you will. And so I've been a big fan of it, but I've also been in the computer industry, been an entrepreneur, been in Silicon Valley, and have been writing about how to bridge, the spiritual worlds with the business world, as well as with the worlds of science and technology. And it so happened a few years ago that I was going through some health issues, and so I was stuck on the couch, and so I decided to reread it one more time, and then I decided to write a series of essays about both about this book, about autobiography of Yogi, as well as other books that were like it, because I like to read the stories of like the miracles of the saints with the two bodies, or the levitating saint,
Mm-hmm.
or the ones who lived for hundreds of years in the Himalayas, and I thought that was kind of unique, but so I just wrote a few essays about it, and I wasn't really planning to write a book about Yogananda and about autobiography of a yogi. And then sometimes we plant a seed that just grows into something, and the universe gives us a task that we're supposed to do. And that's what happened, with this book. Was I had just finished my books about the simulation hypothesis, which is about this idea that we live inside a video game, and I had referenced Yogananda a bit, and then out of the blue, I got an invitation from HarperCollins India, and they basically said it's the 75th anniversary of Autobiography of Yogi, and we don't just want to reprint it. Plenty of people have read it, but then there's plenty of people in kind of the newer generations and in the modern world who have not read it, and who may have a tough time getting into it. And so we'd like to write a book about lessons someone has learned from the book, and also relate it to more modern ideas like computers and the internet. And
Mm-hmm.
Yogananda was very good at doing this. He always tried to bring in the latest technology of his time, but he came to the U.S. in 1920. So he was the first Indian guru to really move here and make an impact. But that was 100 years ago that he came here. And so, basically, I got this invitation dropped in my lap to write this book. And at first, I wasn't sure. I was like, "Are you sure you want me to write it? I'm more of a business guy, a technology guy. I'm not a Swami. My background is in Islam. Culturally, I'm from Pakistan.
Mm-hmm.
But I had written a lot about Yogananda, and they said, no, we think you're the right person to write this book to bridge the gap, for things that people talk about today. And so then I realized this was a task that the universe was putting in front of me, and that's one of the lessons, that I talk about in the book as well. It has 14 lessons that you can learn from Autobiography of Yogi, but really it's about bringing ancient yogic wisdom into the modern world. That's really, what my book is about.
Yeah, because in your book you say today East is West and West is East. So what is a modern yogi?
Well, it's a good question, and in that book, I'm quoting There's an old line from Rudyard Kipling, which said, "East is East and West is West, and never the twain shall meet." And I said,
Mm-hmm.
well, that's relevant today for not really being relevant at all, right? Because today, you can find a yoga studio on every corner, here in California, for example, or in the West, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you go to India or China, you can find probably as many startups there as you'll find in Silicon Valley,
Mm-hmm.
technology startups. And so, back in the time when Yogananda came here, he thought of the West as the materialistic place, and India this more spiritual place. And today, all those lines have been blurred, right? And these philosophies have traveled, and like I said, in no small part, thanks to Yogananda. When the '60s happened here, and the young people began looking for an alternative ways of thought, they turned to the Eastern traditions, and that's what led to it becoming so popular here. But some of these philosophies have now been transformed here in America, and now they've gone back to India. And this is what some scholars call the pizza effect, which is something that I discovered when I interviewed a few religious studies scholars for this
Mm-hmm.
book. So the book contains not only my own stories of lessons that I learned from Autobiography of Yogi, but also stories from other people that I interviewed along the way. And the pizza effect is when something comes to one country from another. So pizza came originally from some small region in Italy. It came to the US, but really it was transformed into what we think of as pizza today, right? The
Mm-hmm.
original pizza was just some bread with a little bit of sauce on it or something, right? But what we think of as pizza today is really almost like a US, I wouldn't say invention, but let's say transformation of the original concept. And now, if you go back to Italy, you can find something that's closer to what we think of as pizza pretty much anywhere in the world, in Italy or
Yeah.
anywhere else. And so the pizza effect is when something travels back. And so Yogananda came here trying to adapt the ancient yogic practices for what was modern at that time, which was after World War One, and now it's gone back to India, and so for that reason, he's actually his book is probably more popular there now than it ever has been. And my book was released first in India and then here in the U.S. And it's actually a bestseller in India. It's available at the airports, on the bestseller lists, the
Mm-hmm.
shelves there at the bookstores. But so, folks there are living modern lives as much as here. And so a modern yogi is someone who really wants to integrate, ancient Eastern philosophy into his life or her life here in
Mm-hmm.
the West. And so it's not about becoming a renunciate. And I would even say today, it's not as much as it was during Yogananda's time, go and find a guru and stay with that guru. I mean, today uh, you can find videos of pretty much all these gurus online, right, on YouTube. So that tends to be, where people go first. They can find, speeches by all these guys. And so it's a very different world than it was in the past because we're so connected, right? You can find videos of gurus in India without having to go there. Now, Steve Jobs, when he was
Mm-hmm.
younger, he traveled all the way to India to look for, some kind of spiritual enlightenment. And what happened was in his dorm room there where he was staying, somebody had left a copy of Autobiography of a Yogi, right? And then he brought it back here and then he reread it every year. And then, according to his biographer, there was that famous biography that came out a couple of years back. When he looked at his iPad, there was only one book on there. It was Autobiography of a Yogi. And when he died at his memorial service, they gave out this little brown box, wooden box. And then when people went home and opened up the box, they found that there was a copy of Autobiography of a Yogi in there. And so
Mm-hmm.
you see that these concepts have traveled back and forth. But back then, he tried to go to India, but then he ended up realizing, oh, this guy who was called the first modern yogi or the first modern guru, Yogananda, lived in the U.S., set up his offices, his headquarters in Los Angeles on top of Mount Washington. It's a beautiful area there. And so that really, being a modern yogi, you're pulling these ancient ideas, and you may be pulling them from different places. You may be pulling them from books like Autobiography of Yogi, from videos, and that's part of it. The other part of it is that uh, when Yogananda was alive, he tried to use modern metaphors to try to get people to understand these ideas. And one of the main ideas within like Hinduism and Buddhism is the concept of Maya or illusion, right? And so Maya means illusion typically, but if you look more closely, it means like a carefully crafted illusion, which generally means almost like a magic show. Like if you go to a magic show, the guy or the magician on the stage isn't really sawing that woman in half, right, and
Right.
putting her back together. It's a trick, but you kind of suspend your disbelief because it looks real and you want to
Mm-hmm.
enjoy yourself. And that's why you enjoy yourself, right? And so Yogananda used the analogy of a movie projector, right? He saw the suffering during World War One, which was called the Great War at the time. Of course, they didn't call it World War One because
Mm-hmm.
people hadn't died on that scale before. It was the first mechanized war, right, where they had like machine guns, and it was right during and after the Industrial Revolution. And
Mm-hmm.
so he said, Lord, how can you allow such suffering? And he got a clear answer when he was meditating, and he saw scenes from the battlefield in France, and he said, which were much worse and more horrific than what he had seen on the newsreels in the theater. And he got the message saying that what you're seeing played out is like a large movie projector, right? It's a play of chiaroscuro, which was a word for Italian art that I had to look up, and it meant light and shadow art that was constructed from light and shadow. And he basically got the message that without light and shadow, you don't have a picture, and that he should view everything that's happening like a great motion picture. And when the characters die in a motion picture, the suffering is real. But on the other hand, the actors don't really die. That is part of
Right.
the part that they are playing. And so that was a very powerful metaphor. And it was one he'd like to use to tell people, look away from the screen. You'll see the light coming in, right? And so
Mhm.
today, though, that's, movies are no longer a new technology, but for young people today, video games are kind of the new technology that is most popular and where we spend where they spend a lot of time. And so, in my previous book, I had talked about this idea of the simulation, which is like the Matrix, that the world is like a computer game. I mean, I'd like to think that if Yogananda were alive today, he'd say, it's like a movie, but we're all the actors and we're all the players, but we're also watching it, and we can change our scripts because we have free will, and we're all doing it together. And what does that sound like? It sounds like a massively multiplayer online role-playing game. And so, that is one of the lessons in this book, is the world is like a movie, a dream, or a video game. And that is perhaps, I think, for today's audience, a more powerful metaphor for the world, is that everything is simulated and built of pixels of light, just like Yogananda was saying. But I believe if he were alive today, he'd be attuned to the latest technology.
I think he would too. And are you basically saying that we are in the matrix, but we can utilize lucid dreaming maybe to wake up from the matrix?
That's one of the things, absolutely. So, I said the world is like a movie, a dream, a video game. And I use the dream metaphor, because it's been a very popular one within the Eastern traditions, in particular in Buddhism as well. I mean, Yogananda himself said life and death are like birth and death are like moving from the doors from one dream to another dream. And in the Tibetan traditions, they've preserved the practice of dream yoga, which actually came out of India and then traveled, up through the Himalayas uh, by a guy named Marpa, the translator, who took it from Kashmir back up to what they call the land of snows, which was Tibet. And there it's been preserved, and that is one of the 6 yogas of Naropa. And this is about what we think of today as lucid dreaming, although there's a whole spiritual idea related to dream yoga, which, in the West, we tend to strip some of these practices of their spiritual significance. Like with meditation, we focus on mindfulness, which focuses on the stress benefits and the health benefits and the mental benefits. Even though meditation was originally meant as a way to realize the nature of reality, right? And so we've done the same with lucid dreaming. But the idea with lucid dreaming and with dream yoga is that if you can wake up in the middle of a dream, you can recognize that what's going on around you isn't real, right? That these are what Yogananda called the movies of the night, right? The movies that we are the directors, screenwriters of, and we screen for ourselves, and then we get so involved in them that we forget that they're not real, right? We've all had that experience where we wake up
Yeah.
in the morning and we're like, oh, whew, glad that was just a dream, right?
Mhm. Or you run to the
But
room and check on everybody and say, oh, there's fear.
right, exactly. But there are practices, and many people are able to do this at some point in their life spontaneously. Although there are techniques to help you do it more regularly. But with dream yoga, the idea is you realize it's a dream as the first step, and then as a second step, you learn to manipulate the dream, because if you realize that the dream is not real, you can do things. And for me personally, my lucidity test is if I can fly, right? So I try to, if I notice something unusual in a dream, I'll say, okay, can I fly? If I can, then it must be a dream, right? And you would be surprised the number of times I've said to myself in a dream, oh, this isn't a dream. This is obviously real. Why should I even bother testing out if I can fly? Because I won't be able to, because it's not a dream. And then suddenly I floated up, from my chair or whatever. And so the dream is meant
Mhm.
to be fool us, right? And
Mhm.
there's a whole other element to dreams about karma, which we can talk about in a minute. But this is the basic idea of dream yoga: is once you learn to have that awareness within the dream that what you're seeing is not real, there's a part of you that's outside of that world, and that it is to some extent an illusion, right? Lacking, as the Buddha said, lacking inherent reality. And when the Buddha became awakened or enlightened, a woman asked him, "What are you?" And he used an ancient word that was based on the Sanskrit "buth," which means to awaken in Sanskrit. So he said, "I am awake," and that's what Buddha means. Which means if he's awake, the rest of us must still be asleep, right? And so that is the basic idea. And so within the video game as well, if you think about it, you can be inside a video game on like League of Legends or World of Warcraft or Fortnite, and you get so involved in it, in your character, you identify with that character. And so in a video game, we have the player who exists outside of the game, and then we have the character or the avatar who exists within the game. And that avatar character is who we associate ourselves with. And so the idea is our body is basically like the character in the video game, right? And I went to the UK this summer, and I gave a talk about Islam and the simulation hypothesis. And that was interesting because, you had some very conservative guys and some very modern guys, people from like Egypt, Germany, you had an Ayatollah from Iran, you had all these guys there. It was a very unusual conference. And I was talking about video games and NPCs, which are non-player characters inside video games. But one of the things they were debating, which religious people tend to do in various religions, is ensoulment. When does ensoulment happen, right? When does the soul go into the body? And there were different answers based on different scriptural things. And I said, well, I'd like to give a different perspective on what ensoulment is. It is like when you put on a virtual reality headset, right? And when you do that and you forget that you actually have a physical body and you think you're just inside the VR headset. Now, how I got into all this was I was playing a virtual reality ping pong game at a startup in Marin County, just across the bay from San Francisco in 2016. And I was playing a ping pong game, a table tennis game. And the headsets were pretty bulky back then, and the graphics weren't even that great compared to today, and certainly nowhere near as good as they're going to be, in a few years. And for a moment, my body forgot instinctively that I wasn't playing a real game of ping pong. And instinctively, I tried to put the paddle down on the table and I tried to lean against the table. But of course, there was no table. So it was all in the VR headset. And my controller fell to the floor and I almost fell over. And that's when I realized we're almost getting to that point where we can fool ourselves that we're inside something like the Matrix, right? That we think it's real. And that, I think, is an apt description for what's going on. And the way to get out of it is to remember that there's a part of you that chose to be here, right? And that there's a part of you that may have even chosen some of the difficult quests, I call them, as they're called in video games. So that's kind of the overview of that idea, that inside the video game, you can remember that there was a time you weren't playing the game.
Okay. Now, when do we escape, if you will, the video game? I mean, when can we be released from this matrix energy that we seem to find ourselves in? Or can we?
Right. Well, I believe, one, we all, first of all, automatically get out of the game during certain periods of our time, and that is accessible through the dream state. But obviously, when we die, we are leaving this physical reality. And so it's like we're saying game over for that specific game, right? But we also have to come back, according to the Eastern traditions, because of karma that we have generated along the way. And so the idea is that we have a database, and this is sort of the modern kind of interpretation of karma that I bring about in my book, is that we have a database of all these different experiences, which I call quests and achievements, because that's how video games are built. And that database, as long as there's stuff in that database, you have to keep going in to play the game, because then you will basically take on another personality and another body, and you will choose a script that says, here's the 10 things that I might do in this life. But while you're playing the game, you could forget about those, right? You might decide, okay, we have something unresolved between myself and another person. We need to have a romantic relationship, but perhaps you never even encounter each other in this life. Therefore, that quest is still in the database. And so I think the idea with karma is that you need to then exhaust that database. Now, some of those people think of karma as big actions, right, that you've taken. But if you look at the Eastern traditions, karma is generated often by the reactions to things and desires. Now, there's a great story in the autobiography, later on in the autobiography. It's about the seemingly immortal Babaji, who was Yogananda calls the Mahavatar Babaji, who lives up in the Himalayas, who supposedly has been around for hundreds of years, maybe even over 1,000 years in the same physical body. And Yogananda's guru was a guy named Sri Yukteswar near Calcutta, and his guru was a guy named Lahiri Mahashai, who was the main guy who contacted Babaji in the not the 20th century, in the 19th century, around 1860. And during that time, Babaji said, Lahiri, I've been waiting for you. Don't you remember me? You encountered him in the mountains up near Raniket, which is a small town in India. And Lahiri was worked for a government accounting office, and he was sent up there. Turns out to be a mistake. He was sent up there, but he had nothing to do. So all he did was wander around the mountains while he was up there. And he came across this guy in a loincloth who looked like he was 25 years old. And it turns out it was Babaji. He goes, don't you remember me from your previous lives? And he goes, no, I don't remember. And then he put him through an initiation where he then remembered his previous lives. And he did something amazing, supposedly. Right? These are these miraculous stories that we hear and we read about, which kind of got me and millions of others excited, from Autobiography of Yogi. The book isn't just about these miracles, it's about the spiritual lessons behind the miracles. But there's the story that just sounded unbelievable. It sounded like it was straight out of the Arabian Nights, right? Like Aladdin. We said, well, Babaji created this giant palace resplendent with jewels right there in the middle of the Himalayas. He materialized it out of nothing so that Lahiri could do his initiation ceremony there. And when he asked him about it, he said, Lahiri, don't you remember in your previous life you expressed a strong desire to live in a palace like a prince? Well, that desire has to be extinguished somehow. Now, you can do it in a future life, but if we just create this for you, we will resolve that quest. And at the end of the night, he said, close your eyes and the entire palace disappeared, right? Which gets back to one, if it happened, how did you do it? Is matter even real? Which gets back to this idea of a video game. But the underlying lesson is a stronger lesson than, oh, wow, look at that. I mean, if you read the original story of Aladdin, that's what the genie does. He creates this palace, right? It's about karma and how our intentions and our desires and our attachments are stored somewhere. And somehow we have to resolve them. And so in this very unusual case, granted, this doesn't happen that often, right? It was resolved in an instant through the materialization of a large palace. In another story about Babaji, who was one of the most intriguing characters, they were sitting around a fire up in the Himalayas somewhere at night, and Babaji grabs a log off the fire and burns the shoulder of one of the cellos, one of the students, disciples. And Lahiri was there, because now this was after his initiation. And he said, well, sir, that's so cruel. Why would you do that to your own disciple? And he says, well, would you rather have him die a fiery death? Right? That was his karma, was that he was supposed to suffer a fiery death. But by providing this little bit of discomfort, and then he healed his shoulder after he burned it, he said, by providing him with the suffering of this little bit of discomfort, we were able to resolve that. And so now he doesn't have to die a fiery death. So that's an experience he no longer needs to have. And so, in trying to bring this into kind of language that we can understand, you can think of it as a video game where these are experiences we're going to have at some point. And the whole point of within the Eastern traditions, particularly Buddhism and Hinduism and some of the mystical traditions of the Judeo-Christian religions as well. But the idea is to stop generating more karma by having too much desire and fear and being so attached to things. And as the Buddha said, if you stop doing this, then that won't happen, right? And the this is feeding the database of things you have to take care of. Now, sometimes the Tibetans say these things can be taken care of in dreams if they're just little impressions. You may have noticed, in a dream, sometimes you'll see something you saw on TV that day, or something made an impression on you. Right? That was
Mm-hmm.
what the Tibetans call a karmic trace, and it was a small trace, but it was enough that it needed to be resolved, and so it just gets resolved in the dream, because dreams are like little simulations, or little worlds, if you will, that we create for ourselves. But some have to be done in the physical world. Anyway, so that's kind of an interesting way to think about all of this.
Okay. Well, in the book, you talk about lesson 5, and that's bilocation, levitation, and telepathy. And I remember back, boy, it was back in 1994, 95. I was still in sales at the time, and I was in the office, making phone calls. And all of a sudden, I noticed that everybody on the team was standing around me. And I looked up and I'm like, well, what's going on? And they said, Monique, you were like 6 inches off the ground. And I'm like, oh, really? Because I had no clue. So talk to us about how we can get to the point of levitation, bilocation, and telepathy.
Well, that's very interesting, that showing that this is still going on, right? So, I spend a lot of time in academia with scientists, and in Silicon Valley with technologists, and there's a lot of skepticism about these old stories. And if you read Yogananda, it sounds like these things were happening all the time, right? There was a levitating saint just down the road from where he lived. There was the saint with two bodies, where Yogananda went to visit this guy in Benares. His father sent him with a note when he was a kid and said, "Go find my friend, Kedarnath Babu, but I don't know where he is, so go visit the Swami first." So he goes to visit the Swami and says, "I have a note for this guy Babu." And the Swami says, "Okay, sit down." And the Swami meditates for half an hour. And Yogananda, as a young kid, was kind of impatient. And he's like, "Okay, well, how are we going to go tell him to come here or give him the note?"
Mm-hmm.
The Swami opens up his eyes and says, "I just told him, don't worry, he'll be here soon." Right. And so the guy shows up like a half hour later, and he looks and he sees the Swami sitting there, and he's amazed. He goes, "Wait, I just saw the Swami like, 30-minute walk away in the marketplace." And Yogananda
Mm-hmm.
said, "Well, he was here the whole time." And so that was, one of many cases of this bilocation. And, you mentioned your own levitation. And so, I went to talk to some religious scholars about this traditions, and does this stuff still happen today? And one of the scholars I talked to was Diana Pasulka, who's a Catholic professor. I mean, she studies Catholicism. She wrote a book called American Cosmic UFOs, Religion, and Technology, which is pretty well known in certain communities. But anyway, she said that in the Catholic traditions, there's a whole host of that. And in academia, they train you to not believe that this stuff is possible.
Uh-huh.
And even as a religious scholar, you're supposed to say, well, these are just stories, they're not real. Right? But then when she went to the Vatican and looked at their archives, she found the canonization records of Joseph of Cupertino. And what she found was the testimony of the devil's advocate, who's the guy that the Catholic Church puts in charge of disproving it. To say this, whenever somebody says there's a miracle, the devil's advocate is supposed to show that's not the case, that this was just
Uh-huh.
BS, right? And
Uh-huh.
she read those, and she saw there were over 1,000 signatures of people that had seen Joseph float up in this town of Cupertino, in this square, up
Uh-huh.
high. And just like in your case, right? And so, then she began to believe that, okay, these things are really happening. So, Yogananda talks about, and yoga itself, if you look at the definition of yoga in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, it's not necessarily the physical postures. It's about stilling what are called the vrittis. The vrittis are like these whirlpools of thought and feeling in the rivers of consciousness. That's how it's kind of translated his famous saying, which is yoga nirodha chitta vrittis, which is the yoga is the cessation of the whirlpools of thought and feeling in the rivers of consciousness. Now, what that means is these whirlpools, we're having them all the time. They're like storms, right? And all we do is it's almost like a snow globe, and we're constantly shaking up the snow globe so we can't see inside. But what happens is these vrittis, according to the ancient Indian traditions, harden into samskaras in our energy field, what they call kosas. And then those become vasanas, or tendencies across lives. And so they harden into karma. And so what happens is that if you loosen these through yoga, any type of yoga, really, it doesn't have to be the physical asanas. They were just one of the 8 limbs of yogas, that your energy field becomes light, and then your physical body becomes lighter. And this can be done through devotion. Like there are many Catholic saints who supposedly this happened to, like Padre Pio is one in the 20th century. who would float up from devotion to God. So clearly, you've lightened your energy field enough that it happens spontaneously. And the same is true within the dream state. I talked about lucid dreaming and flying. There are days when I try to fly up and I can just barely get off the ground. It's like I'm heavy, right?
Mhm.
And there's other times when the energy body they're so easy to fly up and float, thousands of feet in the air. And and what's the difference? It's usually how much stress I'm under, and how much stuff I'm carrying in my field. And so I think the answer to these things is partly in this model that the body is made of light, and if you have a light body, you can, like in a video game, you can create two copies of your avatar. I mean, that's technically possible
Mhm.
within a game, but it's also about how we lighten our load in our energy field. So that's really interesting that you have some witnesses there for having done that. So that's probably one of the more recent stories I've heard about levitation.
Yeah, well, that was more at the time I was really into and studying light body, and it came through. So I took it as a firm um, understanding and validation that I was on the right path for me at that particular time. Now, you say in your book that you should practice a daily ritual no matter what. It can be as short as 5 minutes or an hour or 50 hours. So tell us about why that's so important.
Well, it's important for the same reason that I just, that I just talked about in the definition of yoga itself, right? Because eh, we are constantly creating these vrittis, and so we need to find a way to settle them down. And I talked about the snow globe, and when you shake it, you have to wait for the confetti or the snow to settle before you can really see what's in the scene. And so
Mhm.
every day, it's like all we're doing all day long is just constantly shaking, and we shake it through our reactions. We shake it through the things that happen to us, right? And so the reason to have a little bit of practice, right? It doesn't even matter how much time there is. And one of the things that Yogananda's lineage did was bring this idea that yoga, and at that time, these types of particular practices were only for the monks and the renunciates. Right? I mentioned Yogananda's guru's guru, Lahiri Mahashaya, who had been married, had kids, and was a government employee. And he supposedly became enlightened after that experience because he remembered his previous enlightenments, and he basically continued to work for the government, continued to live the life of a householder. And so, which is more akin to where we are today, right? At that time, even when Yogananda came over to America, India was modernizing, and his brother-in-law and his older brother were like, "What are you doing? Putting on these dirty robes of a monk? Go get a job, right? Do
Mhm.
something real, right?
Mhm.
In the world, be responsible." But because that is the norm for most of us today, most people who are involved in the spiritual path or interested in the spiritual path, have jobs, have families, have things that weigh us down, but they're also the spice of life, right? That if you think about it, that if you've ever played, you remember that old game? I don't know if you remember that, but there was the game called the Game of Life I used to play as a kid,
Yeah, yeah,
right? And you'd roll the
yeah.
dice, and you'd have your little car or whatever, and you'd have your family, you'd have your job, you'd move up, and that is a way to think about the game. And in the Hindu Vedas, there's the tradition of the Leela, which is the divine play of the gods, which could also be thought of as a stage play. Or as Shakespeare said, all the world's a stage and the men and women are merely players. We make our entrances and our exits, and we strut our stuff for, a period of time.
Mhm.
And so that is part of the game of life. But we often forget about the things we're meant to do. And we're constantly, not only are we playing the game, having the experiences we're supposed to have, but we are also stuffing that database that I talked about earlier called karma based upon our reactions. And if we can take some time every day to just calm those, and that could be a form of meditation, a breath meditation, energy meditation, chakra meditation, mantra, could be, in the Islamic traditions, they have a prayer. In various Catholic traditions, there are various prayers that you do. Could be.
Mhm.
I live near Google in Mountain View for part of the year, and there's like a little park called Shoreline Park that
Mhm.
looks out over the bay, and I feel like I'm 1,000 miles away from Silicon Valley right? when I'm there.
Yeah.
And so just
Yeah.
taking a walk with the air from the breeze from the bay blowing cleans the aura. So it's about not having these things harden. And then turns out that also has great benefits for our mental health and our physical health as well. And so, I think sometimes we think, okay, we were not able to meditate for an hour like all these self-help gurus do say they should do, right? The guys who say they get up at 5 a.m. and they meditate for an hour. That's just not practical for most people, right? So
Mhm.
it's good to have any kind of practice that stills the whirlpools of thoughts and desires and feelings in the river of consciousness. And whatever that is your spiritual practice.
Mhm.
And that's why it's important to have even a little bit of that. In the Bhagavad Gita, it says a little bit of this yoga, right, will
Mhm.
save you much troubles down the road.
Yeah, down the road. Yes, it will. Now, what are your thoughts on working with mala beads? Is that also a form of meditation and a daily practice, daily ritual?
Well, it certainly could be. Absolutely. I mean, different people have different types of beads, and I don't know specifically. Was it the mala beads? I don't know those specifically, but in a lot of traditions, what you have the rosary beads in the Catholic tradition, in Islamic traditions, we have the tasbih, which are like these beads that you use to say a mantra over and over again. So there's a lot of different traditions that do use beads as part of your practice.
Okay. Right. Now, when we go to your website, zenentrepreneur.com, what are we going to find there?
Yeah, so it's zenentrepreneur.com, which was based on the title of my very first book, which was called Zen Entrepreneurship, which was about bringing spirituality in the world of startups. And so there they can download free chapters of my various books, including the Wisdom of a Yogi, as well as Simulation Hypothesis and the Simulated Multiverse. They'll find links to articles that I've written. They can also find links to my social media. They can follow me on Twitter at Riz Stanford, RIZ Stanford, just like the university.
Mhm.
And I usually post, some of my interviews there. And then there's links to my podcast, and they can contact me there as well.
Okay. I've really enjoyed speaking with you today. Could you leave us with a pearl of wisdom, please?
Sure, absolutely. I'll quote from the autobiography of a yogi, since that's what we were talking about. And he said, man's intuition is soul guidance, coming naturally to him or her these days in times when the mind is calm, right? And
Hmm.
so we get soul guidance when the mind is calm. And that's why it's important to have a little bit of practice to calm the storm of rhythms every day.
All right. Absolutely beautiful. Well, Riz, thank you so much for being my guest today. I greatly appreciate it. And know the audience does too. I am truly honored to have spent time with you, and I know the audience has the same sentiment. And everyone, please remember that the most important choice that you can make is what you choose to make important. Consider making the masterful choice of discovering the wisdom of a yogi. Abundant blessings, light, and love to all. Agape.